Perfect. All right. What's up? Good morning. PT on Ice Daily Show. Dr. Jeff Moore here, CEO of ICE, lead faculty for cervical spine management and lumbar spine management. Good to see everybody. Good to be here this morning. Fresh off of my CrossFit Level 1 class. So I was in Boston last week. It was great. They had a midweek class. I teach most to every weekend. So it was wonderful to have a midweek class to be able to go to and not interrupt the weekend. Always good to be in Boston. So I love that city. I've always loved that town. So I was able to get some good North End Italian, get some cannolis. Probably shouldn't be knocking that stuff out during my CrossFit Level 1 training, but certainly got after some of that. Trillium Brewery was fantastic. So thanks for all the brewery recommendations that you guys fired at me on Instagram and Facebook while I was over there. So I wanna unpack. It's Leadership Thursday, but this one might be a little bit more clinically focused. But I want to unpack some of my key takeaways from that Level 1 course because there were a ton. For those of you who have done it, first of all, it's an incredibly well-ran course. They really do run it with military precision. It's absolutely seamless. The facility was gorgeous. I'm repping the Reebok CrossFit 1 facility right down there on the dry dock, right by the water. Just gorgeous CrossFit facility. So everything about the weekend was first class. The humans that were involved, the setup that took place, it was a wonderful, wonderful weekend. So if you get a chance, you want to learn a lot about movement and maybe some of the things I'm going to talk about here this morning, do look into that CrossFit Level 1. I have not heard anybody come away and not have the review that I'm uttering here this morning. So what? Right away, the tone was set for me. I was impressed right out of the gate. So, going into the first section, James Hobart and his crew were the folks that led my course, and they were incredible. And they talked about scaling early, and they talked about the importance of scaling. In fact, they went as far as saying, if you want to become great at anything to help a huge amount of people, become great at scaling. Right? They have a scaling course, and they talked about how important that was to be able to provide everybody a stimulus in the way that they needed to be provided. So that was a big part of the early portion of the course. But one of the things that really got me engaged early was that James was talking about, scaling a program for Tia, an arbitrary made-up fictional character, but a young, hardcore athlete, and Tia's grandmother, right? And giving them the same WOD, but of course scaling it for Tia's grandmother. And James said, during the squatting section, Tia's grandmother might be squatting down to a box because she hasn't picked up that knee, hip, or ankle range of motion yet. And what caught me, and he didn't even mean, what caught me was the yet. Right? There was no doubt in my mind when James said that he believed that Tia's grandmother was going to pick up that range of motion. Right? In other words, you could tell he believed so unfailingly that this program works for everybody, that Tia's grandmother's range of motion was going to improve. And you could see that was not the focus of the section, but I picked up on it because it was said so naturally. You could tell that he was absolutely certain it was going to work for Tia's grandmother. She doesn't quite have that range of motion yet, right? She's going to get it. There's no doubt about that, but it's not there yet. And it made me think right out of the gates, do I have that kind of conviction, right? Do physios have that kind of conviction that people who go through our programs are guaranteed that level of success, of movement competency change, of physical prowess escalation? Do we believe it that strongly? That we say things with that kind of unconscious conviction. And it was a real gut check for me because I question if I have pushed enough people hard enough and strong enough physically to see those gains on some of the hard gainers, right? On some of the folks that have more things on board that are hard to get them to that next level. And what it made me realize was that you only get to that kind of unconscious belief when you have seen so many people make those gains that it becomes impossible not to believe it. And you could tell there was no doubt that that's where James was. So right out of the gates, I was just so impressed by that conviction that I know has come from the evidence of experience. So the tone was set. I was fully engaged, and I was ready to soak it in. So four things that I took away that have got me thinking over the past week. Two that I think are maybe more clinical, and maybe two that are from a teaching perspective. Because you can imagine, as somebody who does a lot of teaching myself, I'm always watching that side of it, how they're running the course, what they're doing that I could do better. And certainly there was plenty, so I'll try to pull out a couple. But first, the clinical one. So it was so funny to watch. For those of you who have been there, for those of you who haven't and don't understand how it runs, you go over didactic sections, maybe you go over a movement like the squat, and then you go out in small group and you do the squat, and you do it in small groups, and there's tons of faculty there that come around and help you groove out your squat pattern, and observe those in your group and groove out their squat pattern. And it was funny, one thing, a lot of us were in healthcare in different areas, and one thing that we would all inevitably talk about was when there was a noticeable fault, myself included, we would all want to pull out the fault into isolation, right? Work on it, and then think that that was somehow going to get added back into the movement, right? Like for example, during deadlifting, right? Talking about someone having a hard time keeping a good position in the bottom of the deadlift, and all of us saying to our faculty member, hey, well, she says she's tight in the back of her legs. Would stretching her hamstrings help with this? And the faculty would repeatedly say, no, deadlifting would help with this, right? And that happened over and over and over again, right? Would maybe mobilizing her ankles might help with that squat. Yeah, maybe. Or maybe squatting would help with that squat, right? And so we were always kind of brought back to, why don't we try to do it in the pattern? Because while, yeah, we get it, like maybe her ankles are tight, right? And maybe breaking out that component and working on the tight ankles might, when she goes back to squatting, help to clean that pattern up. But really, isn't what we want improved range of motion in the squat pattern? And shouldn't we try to correct that here in real time? So it kind of goes back to the thing that we talk a lot about in the CMFA division, and that is that coach first mentality. As opposed to thinking you see something, breaking it out, taking them totally out of the movement, doing it in isolation, and then kind of thinking or hoping that when you come back to the actual total neuromuscular demands of the movement, that what you did in isolation is going to show back up inside of that pattern. Now, I'm not saying it isn't. But like the coaches were saying this weekend, if we can practice it inside of the pattern, we should practice it inside of the pattern, because we don't need more dorsiflexion range of motion. We need more ankle movement inside of the squat pattern. Like that's what we're trying to pick up. So if we can give some good cues to challenge that limitation while we're actually in the pattern, the neuromuscular and total gains of that and our ability to access and load that movement are going to be escalated far more dramatically. So it was so funny to watch all of us always wanting to pull the person out of the pattern and look at something or work on something and then put them back in the pattern, whereas the coaches were always saying, let's keep them in the pattern. They're not max loaded, so they should be able to make adaptations in the pattern. Let's keep them in the pattern where the goods and the skill can be worked on at the same time as maybe the mobility or the strength, and do it all in one shot. Like over the weekend, that was something that really was my attention was drawn to, and my thought about how I behave clinically or how I work with my athletes at the gym really gave me some food for thought. So I think challenge yourself on that. Like before you abort the pattern and try to isolate what you think might be the main component and triage that, really work on that pattern in real time. Because it could be that a lack of stability is making something look like a mobility restriction and all these other things. The point is, you don't even need to break it down that cerebrally. Just work on it in the pattern and see if it clears up. So that coach first mentality was definitely doubled down to me in those 2 days last week. The other cool part that I really took a lot away from was their conversation on safety. So it was cool because they talked about both sides of it. So both, that oftentimes CrossFit gets challenged on, hey, that's unsafe to do those complex or multi-joint weight-bearing movements quickly because injury can happen. And yet they're also oftentimes criticized that they load people too much, right? And that, they're going for PRs too often, or there's too many max lifts. And it was fun to hear sort of the musings on both sides of that. So the first one really resonated, and that was that they want people. So the CrossFit methodology wants people at that speed wobble, right? So they actually want their athletes during their workouts when they're not under max loads, right, to be seeing some quote unquote form errors, right? right? In fact, saying that if someone's performing perfectly and there's absolutely no form errors whatsoever, maybe seeing that as a warning sign of, are you pushing that person hard enough, right? Do you need to maybe speed them up a bit and start to see at least some subtle form breakdown, because we know that people fail at the margins of their experience. So we want to push people towards those margins and see that growth, right? So the willingness to increase somebody's speed and challenge someone to get to a point where you're seeing some of that breakdown is actually encouraged, which has real life safety and functional carryover, right? Because they talked about when you go to bend down and grab something off the floor, or you go to pick up your kiddo and move him to the other part of the room, you don't do it with perfect technique. You do it out of convenience, right? You do it out of adaptation. The kid is moving around and scrambling. So you're going to bend down and grab that kid a different way every time. What makes that safe in life is being exposed to it in the gym, right? So if you're going fast and you're seeing some subtle form breakdowns, what you're really seeing is diverse exposure to varied movement patterns or different ways of accomplishing the task, but you're doing it at sub-max loads. So you're exposing yourself to slightly different ways of picking things off the floor, or moving with weight on your shoulders, or getting weight overhead, which has carryover to real life where you move things in different ways. So some of that diverse exposure is what actually makes real life safe. So being in that speed wobble space where you're not only moving in one way, right? You're moving in varied ways because form is quote unquote breaking down. That is giving your body diverse exposure, which is what happens in life, which is what makes life safe. And so I thought that was a really cool way of looking at it's not only okay if somebody has a little bit of form breakdown under submaximal loads. There's actually, in some ways, number one, we want them there because we know we're pushing them hard enough. And number two, some of that diverse movement exposure is going to carry over into life. So I thought the functional understanding of that was brilliant. But then they talked about under max loads, we do get really picky. The reason is we believe that straight lines are strong lines. Like, we believe there is a best, most efficient way to move mass. And from an injury standpoint, while we can argue about this and Lord knows it has happened, there probably is a best way to move extremely heavy things, right? And the way they illustrated that, and I thought this was a great visual, was they said, let's say your deadlift PR is 315 pounds, right? And we load a bar up with 700 pounds, which you're not going to be able to budge. But we tell you, we want you to bend down there and grab that bar in whatever deadlift posture you choose. And we want you to pull as hard as you possibly can. Now, you know that bar is not going to move, but you are going to pull with every ounce of strength you have. What position do you want to choose, right? The odds are you are going to choose one where there's good, strong, straight lines, right? Head is up, chest is up, weight in the heels, you're dialed in, mass is close to you. You're going to choose a posture that feels safe, that feels strong, right? You're going to choose strong lines, straight lines. And if you pull as hard as possible, what's probably going to happen is a whole bunch of nothing. And they reiterated that with perfect posture, with great technique, even under max loads, injury should be extraordinarily rare. Now, if you bend over and round your back Jefferson curl style and try to yank 5 times as hard as absolutely possible, of course no injury is guaranteed, but certainly I wouldn't try to move the weight that way. If I saw my wife trying to move max loads that way, I'd probably cue her, hey, try to straighten out that back, get into a more neutral position, give yourself a little bit of pressure around that spine and see if we can't clean those lines up a bit before you put every ounce of strength you have possible through that system. So I talked a lot about how even under extremely heavy loads, really crisp form might reduce injury incidence. And I love that they talked about both sides, both the importance of being willing to break form, and then at certain times under max loads, the importance of trying to maybe capture that form. So to me, that spectrum is really important to understanding, where we are and when to try and modify form and when to maybe let it ride. So some food for thought. I've been thinking a lot about that this past week, both in the gym as well as with some patients I've been rapping with. So those are my two from clinical thoughts. Does stretching fix that? No, squatting fix that. And this idea of safety on the lower end of weight, being willing to explore diverse movement and be in the speed wobble on very maximal loads, maybe trying to clean those physics up to be more efficient on moving that mass, as well as putting force through your system that we absorb a bit better. From a teaching perspective, there was gold all weekend, right? So it was a master class in presentation, and there were a couple of things I pulled out that I thought were particularly skillful, and I had a chance to talk to James about these, but I was really impressed with a number of things. Number one was the way that they repeated questions and at least entertain novelty. So for those of you who are teaching and working on your presentation style, as you get to higher volumes, one thing you're going to inevitably notice is that a lot of the questions become the same, especially if your content is similar. And like James said, they teach the same thing every weekend, right? So 35, 40 weekends a year, it is the same game, right? The same lectures, the same movements, same foundational patterns, right? The 9 movements they go through, and it's the same thing every time. So a lot of the questions, of course, wind up being the same. And I've experienced plenty of that in my personal teaching career. And what was wonderful was, when these questions came up, James did an incredible job of entertaining them as though they were novel, which can be tough. If you've heard the question, 5,000 times, it can be hard to actively listen to it as though it's the first time you heard it. But I gotta say, the guy did the whole team did a masterful job. I mean, one of the questions was, during squatting, should we use lifts, like either lifting shoes or Versa lifts or what have you, to maybe clean up that pattern if somebody's ankles are restricted? And I'm telling you, James took on that question like it was the first time he had ever heard it. Like, yeah, it's a good thought. Like, maybe restricted ankles limiting squatting, in that being a relevant variable. As though he has not heard that every single weekend over the past 5 years, 40 times, that, maybe someone's ankles being a bit gummed up are making their squat pattern laborious, right? But he took it on as though like, hey, it's a great thought, like restricted ankles, and talked all about, the mechanics of dorsiflexion, why that might be a good idea. But then, and this is the part that I want you guys to focus on, did a wonderful job of enveloping that into a bigger picture to avoid unnecessary redundancy from that point forward. What I mean by that was he said, and that kind of brings up this bigger concept of, should we use crutches? Right? Should we use straps? Should we use all these other things that might enable us to move more weight or improve our form, but are sort of artificially doing so? The brilliance of that was that while he entertained this question fully with all of his attention and certainly made that learner feel attended to and comprehensively addressed, he also took the opportunity to make sure he doesn't get a million of those questions, right? Because if he hadn't done that, every time we go and do something, hey, when we deadlift, should we use straps, right? When we do pull-ups, should we use the grips? What he did was took the one question about Versa lifts and said it brings up a bigger concept of using crutches. How often should we do it? What are the pros and cons? And nailed all of that in one shot. So think about the efficiency that escalated that class because of the opportunity that he took at that moment. So 2 learning moments there. Number 1, the learner, it's the first time for them asking the question. As a faculty, we know you've gotten it a million times, right? But nothing is worse for a learner who was willing to be a bit uncomfortable and raise their hand than to have you have a look in your face that says, oh yeah, we get that question all the time. Right? And beautiful job by the faculty last week, not only not doing that, but I would say going to the far end and then capitalizing on that moment to wrap in so many other aspects. So thought that was just wonderful. The other thing that I love that I really have not seen in any other classes was the way they set their expectations for each individual lecture component. So it was really cool that James introduced whatever faculty member was going to come up and do the next section. But the way he did it dramatically built expectations on behalf of the learner. Because James went up there and said, guys, here's what we're going to talk about next. Megan's going to come up here and talk about programming. Here is why this is so critical. And Here's why Megan is so perfect to talk about this, right? Megan's experience goes from the highest level of athlete all the way down to the very beginner. She's managed all these different boxes, and James really sets you up for like, man, this is going to be great. Like, I need to know this. I'm so glad Meg's the one teaching it, and you were so ready by the time that Meg got up there and so dialed in. Your expectations were so high, you were riveted. So just setting that scene at each section to get you dialed in for your maximal performance, I thought was incredibly classy and well done. So that was great. And then the moment they were done, last thing I'll say, I know I'm getting kind of long. It was a big week. The moment that they got done introducing or what have you, the faculty went and sat behind the group and were absolutely riveted to whoever was presenting. They weren't on their phones. They weren't talking to each other. They were dialed in to the presenter as though they have never heard the content in their lives. What that did was it created this environment of anything else seeming preposterous, right? I mean, here are these folks behind you who do this every weekend, are on the edge of their seats trying to grab one more nugget from that presenter. Right? They're not on their phones. They're not talking to each other. So you doing so would seem absolutely out of the question. Because they were leading from the front, you could not help but follow. Their behavior of excellence elevated everybody else to the same. Because there was no way you would have felt comfortable pulling out your phone when you've got all the faculty behind you staring over your head at the presenter with a level of intention that you know you should be exuding. They were about it. And because they were about it, so was everybody else. I thought those were things that heighten the level of the class to a very different level. Both the incredible question taking, the wrapping into bigger concept, and this idea of setting expectations for each lecture and then being about it as an active audience member. So hopefully you guys, those four things, 2 from the clinic maybe and 2 from the podium are takeaways for you. I walked around Boston and meditated a lot about the quality of the course and how it can take us to the next level. And I just want to say thank you to those who were there presenting because that truly was a masterclass performance. So thank you so much. As for me, I'm off to Michigan, Ann Arbor, Michigan for cervical spine this weekend. So we've got a really nice group. Atletico's got a bunch of folks, and we have a few open folks coming in. So going to have a great group this weekend. I know Blacksburg, Virginia is coming up in the next couple of weeks for lumbar spine. I think those are 2 that are on my docket in the very near future. And outside of that, I'll get out of your way. I've taken enough of your time this morning. Go enjoy the rest of your Thursday, and I'll see you here in the next couple of weeks on PT on Ice. Cheers, everybody.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.